Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about Dark Souls 3 and why I think it's the best in the Souls series, right? Just to clarify, this is coming out of my recent gauntlet through Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, Demon Souls, and Bloodborne, and I think out of all of those, Dark Souls 3 is the best. Originally I was going to make a longer video about a lot of reasons why I think that's the case, but I think it was a little too long to, keep people watching and have a good attention span for it, so I think I'm going to break them down into hopefully 3 different smaller videos, and this one's going to be talking about world building, more specifically the lore and how it builds to the final decisions in the games. But yeah, again, this is entirely my opinion, right? A lot of people like the other games for different reasons, and that's totally fine. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and if you have any other comments of your own, please don't hesitate to comment, I guess. So yeah, we'll get right into this video. Thank you guys again for watching. So the first thing we want to talk about here for like world building and lore and stuff is kind of, I think the biggest argument against why Dark Souls 3 wouldn't be the best at world building is because Dark Souls 1 literally built the world. So I just want to clarify kind of what I mean by this. I'm more talking about like the lore of each game kind of has its own theme and how it leads to the ending of the game and the choices you get to make. So this is something that while I was doing a bunch of Dark Souls lore, because I want to make a full just specific lore video, not just on Dark Souls 3, but I can't seem to get it to work right. But basically when I was doing that research, I stumbled upon a Reddit post that said like, more looking at Dark Souls 2, that it's a very zoomed in perspective, right? And that's why in the earlier days it was kind of considered not a true sequel because it didn't seem to follow directly. But with DLCs and other stuff that have come out, it kind of does connect now. But I liked that idea of that it's a zoomed in perspective, and I kind of got this idea of how all 3 games kind of fit as certain pieces into the entire world and lore that is the Dark Souls universe, especially 1, 2, and 3, right? And with that, with being each a separate part, they all kind of do their own thing, and I want to just make the point that I think Dark Souls 3 does its part the best, right? So we can kind of think of Dark Souls 1 as this world creating game, right? It gives us the lore that is kind of the action that keeps all the games going along, right? Pretty much everything that happens in that opening sequence with Gwyn fighting the Ancients and the 4 lords getting the 4 souls, right? That's all kind of the consequence of that conflict, right, is kind of what drives Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. So it really just builds this world and creates it. And then you can get into Dark Souls 2, which I see as world defining, right? It shows you the exact like consequence of what's become of Gwyn's decision and the events of Dark Souls 1, right, where you fracture Manus' soul, right, and we see that those carry on throughout the ages into this current cycle that you're in, and things are kind of going to chaos because of that, but also kind of what the world's come to after all of these rekindlings and fadings of the fire, and how people now are more worried about getting out of this curse than they are worried about the fire, right? And then finally we get to the end, right, the world ending game, which is Dark Souls 3, and right, the theme of that one is kind of more now, what is, where does it all lead to, right? What happens when the fire finally does go out, right? All of a sudden, this fire takes importance again, kind of like Dark Souls 1, but more in the sense that it's kind of starting to fade forever, and what are we going to do about that and what it looks like. So that's kind of how I view all 3 games, kind of running off of that Reddit post vibe. So when you look at it like that, I think that obviously Dark Souls 1 does a great job of giving us this world, but the decision that it has at the end I don't think is very impactful, and that's kind of the point that I want to make with this world building. Like with all of the build-up in the lore, each game kind of does it slightly in its own way to follow its themes, and then we get this final decision at the end of each game, and I think Dark Souls 3 gives us the most impactful final decision for me, or at least one of the endings does. And I think that's what makes Dark Souls 3, in my opinion, the better game, is that it builds up to something that's more important than the other games do. So we'll get into that right now, right, with Dark Souls 1. As genre defining as it is, I think the ending of the game leaves a lot lacking, right? It doesn't do anything. I think that's my problem with kind of Dark Souls 1 and 2 endings, is nothing changes. And I get that that's the point of Dark Souls 1, kind of like we've built this cycle, right? We've created this cycle, and now this is like the definitive moment at the end, is that no matter what we do, because of what Gwyn did, this cycle is always going to continue, right? Even if you walk away, somebody else is going to come and light the fire. Look at me, rekindle the flame, baby! Yeah! Age of Fire! Yeah! Even like as it starts to fade, right, the embers will burn up again, and the fire will restart, and it'll keep extending, right? And that's kind of the world that we're in. But that makes your final decision less impactful, right? It doesn't matter what you do at the end of the game, which is kind of, it's fitting for the theme, but again, as an impact to me as a player, going through all of this, just to get to an ending where nothing I do matters is kind of, it takes away from the game for me, because it is such a cool world that they've built, but then this cyclical ending is just not as interesting to me. That ending where you get to the end, it's almost like the ending where it's all a dream, right? It doesn't matter, right? It's just kind of doesn't leave anything, right? So that's my problem with Dark Souls 1 for the most part, right? We do get the cool, like I said, lore and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, the final end decision, it just doesn't do it. So then we can move on to Dark Souls 2, right, which I think has the most complex lore, in my opinion, right? If you look at Dark Souls 1, it's pretty simple. Go light the fire or don't light the fire, but we need to extend the Age of Fire to keep life going and the stuff like that. And then it's the same for Dark Souls 3, but probably even more simple, where it's just, they tell you straight up, these guys did not do their jobs, go bring them to do their jobs, take their power, and light the fire yourself. I know there's many more layers to both games, but I think Dark Souls 2 is the one that most pushes the you don't know what's going on thing, right? Even from the start, like, you'll be like, I think the opening schematic even tells you, like, you're gonna go and do this thing, and then you won't even know why. And even certain item descriptions tell you, like, but what of the people outside? Like, you don't even know, like, really what's going on. And that's honestly, I see that more looking back at how I played it, right? I played it back in high school and I played it recently, many years in between, but at both times I didn't really know what was going on. I mean, sure, I didn't read everything, but at least with Dark Souls 1 and 3, I kind of had this idea of what was happening. But Dark Souls 2, I was like, I don't, like, why is Vendrick down there? Who is this queen? Stuff like that. How does this all tie in? And I know that there's descriptions for it, but it's like, it's not like I read more descriptions in the other games. It's just like, just going through it, it just, the dialogue and stuff, it just doesn't all completely tie in that easily. And so to me, that makes it feel like it's complex lore, which is great. I do like it, but again, we get to this decision that once the veil comes off, right, once we kind of get that reveal about Nisandra and she wants the throne and stuff, and you win, obviously, when you deal with Aldea and stuff like that, if you're playing Scholar of the First Sin version, right, which is pretty much main version that's there now, right, again, you're getting with two options. You can take the throne or walk away, and personally, this is kind of like the most unimportant ending, right, because it's the same thing. If you take the throne, you don't, like, that just gives you the option, as I see it, as how I understood it, is like the person that gets the throne has the power now to relight the fire if they choose. So it's kind of the same as Dark Souls 1, where you finally have done everything you need to do to get to that fire, and you can decide to walk away or not. And that's kind of what taking the throne does, which is why in the original game, well, I guess that theory is supported by the original game only having one ending, where you get to go to the throne, right? And then they added the Scholar of the First Sin with Aldea, and now you have another option that more focuses on the theme of the game, which is exiting that cycle. And while I do like the lore of exiting the cycle, again, you're left with a decision that doesn't actually change really anything in the confines of Dark Souls 2, right? You just leave and you go off with Aldea, or you just leave the area, and you're basically, your quest now is to find a way out, like he was, right? Like all the other characters kind of in this game are trying to do, find a way out of this curse, right? But again, you're left with a decision where even after all you've done, you don't really get a sure answer. I know that you can get the crown, which will kind of alleviate the curse, at least for the one that wears it, right? You do kind of get to that, but that doesn't really matter for the ending, right? You don't have to, as far as I know, since it involves a DLC, you don't need that crown for any purpose for the ending, right? It doesn't change it. So I don't think it's kind of thought of as a real, true way out of the cycle, because it's only a temporary fix, and that's kind of, it's just overshadowed by the fact that, again, nothing's changed. So you kind of, again, get this dull ending where it doesn't matter. And again, that's kind of the point of the games. I get that, but again, just for me, those kind of endings just leave so much. like they could have done cooler stuff, at least change something in the world, but nothing does change. And I get that that's the point of the cycles and all the things, like I've said, but again, in terms of everything leading up to an ending, Dark Souls 3 is going to do it best, because they give you an ending where things actually change, and it ties all of the three games, in my opinion, together, which is why I like it too. It's not just the fact that it fits the theme of the game, but it also ties in themes from the other games, right? So for the Dark Souls 3, since we need to hop into that and why it's the best, in my opinion, is the Lord of Hollows ending, right? There are other endings that will be just kind of the same as the other games, but they do have this Lord of Hollows ending, which I think gives you the most satisfying ending for the entire series, right? To get that, right, we can kind of talk about NPCs really quickly. I think Dark Souls 3 has the most influential NPCs for this kind of similar reason, that they tie into the ending, right? To get the Lord of Hollows ending, you have to do all of the NPC quests for Henri correctly, get the marriage rite completed, and then finish the game and decide to usurp the fire, right? So a lot of things have to go right to get this ending, but there is this NPC that comes through the game with you and actually has an impact on the game, and I don't think that's found in Dark Souls 1 or 2. The closest you could get is maybe Darkstalker Kaith, if you want to think of him as a companion, quote-unquote, NPC, because he does tell you a lot of lore and kind of sways you towards walking away, but you don't actually have to talk to him to walk away, right? It doesn't actually change any endings. The ending's still there if you talk to him or not. In Dark Souls 2, the closest one would be Aldea. He's probably the closest, but he is like a boss, so I don't know if you consider him a companion. He does, you know, show up at bonfires every once in a while. You talk to him at bonfires, but in terms of just those NPC companions that you kind of fight people with and hang out with at bonfires, right? I don't think he really fits into that category exactly, right? He does drop a lot of lore, but I'm more looking at the companions that are with you throughout the game. And I think Dark Souls 3 has those best ones. With Henri, I know she's not as probably, I want to say, likable. Like, I like Solaire and probably Siegmeyer and Siegward, right? They're funny, cool, and entertaining characters, right? More so than Henri, her dramatic story with her partner, right? But my problem with the Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 people is that they all kind of, their story ends in their own way, and it's their own self-contained thing. And I just feel like with Henri, you get this, you can, if you do it correctly, get this storyline that actually intertwines with yours. And I think that kind of just makes that lore and that build up a lot more impactful, that you've been with this character throughout the game and then something actually happens with them at the end, right? And then now this leads into the satisfying ending, which is this Lord of Hollows endings, which is what you get if you do everything with Henri and usurp the flame. And the reason that I say it ties all the games together, because in Dark Souls 1, if you do talk to Darkstalker Kaith, right, he warns you that Gwyn, basically the reason you got the Dark Sign is after the fight with the Ancients, right, and then the Age of Fire began, right, he shackled the Dark Soul with the Dark Sign because he feared this dark lore and the power of the Dark Soul, right? And I think this ending shows us what that power is that he feared, right? It's that, you know, be kind of this undying being that can withstand the First Flame and take it as a hollow and be able to have command over the First Flame and the Dark Soul. Again, this kind of command over the First Flame, right, usurping that flame, you can kind of get it from the ending, but definitely when I was doing research, I found like Reddit posts and stuff that suggested this, so them holding the power of the First Flame isn't entirely my idea, but I think it's a fantastic thing that makes sense, right? That idea makes sense because that would fit with the power that Gwyn feared, right? That the Dark Soul has this ability to control the other kind of First Flames, right? That would definitely be something that he would be fearful of, right? If they were these undying beings that could do that, then we see that in Dark Souls 3, right? That's realized. We get this Dark Lord, this Lord of Hollows, right, that Gwyn feared. So it ties into Dark Souls 1 in that way. Dark Souls 2 is all about ascension of the cycle, and again, if it's true that they are holding now the First Flame, the power of the First Flame, while still maintaining their power as having the Dark Soul, right? They kind of have command over both the Age of Fire and the Age of Darkness, right? So they have, in all intents and purposes, ascended out of the cycle. If they can control what comes next, then they are kind of above being a part of that cycle, at least. And my headcanon is that if you bring light and dark together, you get this gray area. So although the ending kind of pushes you towards this Age of Darkness or whatever, I think it would be kind of cool if, in my headcanon, that it becomes a new Age of Ancients, like this gray expanse, because that's what happens when you bring light and dark together. You get this kind of gray area. And I like to think that that's kind of where it ends up going, is that they break out of this cycle, and that would fulfill the Dark Souls 2 theme. But I mean, either way, even if it doesn't go to the gray, I would argue that having power over the First Flame and the Dark Soul would give you power over both the Age of Fire and Age of Dark, and thus ascending you out of the cycle, right? And so it would fulfill Dark Souls 2 theme. It also then fulfills Dark Souls 3 theme of like everything coming together, that something has finally changed, like this is the end of this never-ending cycle, right? Finally, right, we've had 2 games with 2 endings that just pound this idea of nothing matters, and the game is cyclical, and the fire is always going to be relit. And now Dark Souls 3 is like, well, we're at the end of that, right? And finally we do get this ending that gives us a true way out, like something actually changes, right? At least if you do this Lord of Hollows ending, that's the takeaway that I got from playing through and doing this, right? I got the sense that finally, like, something has changed. So it fulfills the Dark Souls 3 of everything coming together to make a change, right? And I think that's like what makes that Dark Souls 3 lore right? The theme of the game building up, like I said, to the final decision makes that final decision the most impactful out of the games, which to me gives it more replayability. Like, I want to play it. I like that something changed finally. Again, this is a personal thing. Like, I'm not saying the ending of Dark Souls 1 and 2 don't make sense for those games, because they are so much about the cycle and light and dark and it never ending, so you get an ending that never ends, right? But then Dark Souls 3, I think with this ending, you do finally get something that changes, and I think that just, for me, makes the lore of the individual game the best. In terms of world building, right, we do get this world that is ending, and we do get an end. At least if you grab this ending. I know, once again, there are other endings. There's like 4 of them where nothing changes again, right? You can relight the fire if you want, and it'll be a small little ember, or you can let it go to darkness, but it's kind of implied that eventually some embers will come and relight the fire again anyway, so it's just, you can get other endings that are less satisfying, but to me, this one, right, it was the best and most satisfying ending that tied the games together. And as a side note, I'm a really big fan of the Chaos Flame lore, right? The fact that the Witch of Izalith got the life soul and decided to try to remake the first flame for herself so that she could kind of get out of this age of fire and darkness on her own, but then ended up making a Chaos Flame, and the demon, basically every demon in the game is from that. And you kind of, once you beat the Demon Prince in the DLC, you get the lore that the demons were kind of doing the same thing that the Dark Souls are doing, right? Or at least that everything that's happening with the first flame and stuff like that, relighting it, they're doing that with the Chaos Flame too. But then when you defeat the Demon Prince, right, you kind of take away their ability to do that. There was an old description and a new description of the Demon Prince soul. The old one said that the fire was out, but then obviously I read a lot of comments that said it's funny because it says that the Chaos Flame is ended and so has the demon race, and then you immediately walk out the door, put a banner down, and demons fly you to a new area. So it's like they changed it, I think, is what I saw, to accommodate for that. But I still think that it's implied that the flame has been lit for the last time, and you kind of now have the Chaos Flame, kind of like you're going to go get the first flame, right? You own that now, and so they can't really relight it now, right? It's not that they're completely done, right? Probably just the last of the few kind are still around, but you own it, and kind of the Chaos Flame cycle ends. And so I thought that was really cool that they really even tied that into the game. So again, like, I just really like that there's so much happening in Dark Souls 3 that has an impact on the world and the story and the lore. So that is why I think Dark Souls 3 has the best world building in terms of lore. Yeah, if you guys have anything to say about that, if I got some of the lore stuff wrong, I know I kind of went into headcanon quite a bit, but that's kind of the fun part. If your headcanons differ or there's a description that I missed, as always, please feel free to correct me or share your own. I always love talking about this stuff. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys all in the next video, probably talking about Dark Souls 3 in terms of locations and DLC and stuff like that. And then later, the third video, I plan to be combat, because I want to make a whole video on the combat and why it's the best in the series for different reasons. Again, that's all I have for that. Thank you guys again for watching, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye!